Welcome back to This Week in Immigration. I'm your host, Jack Malday, Associate Director at the Bipartisan Policy Center. In this week's episode, BPC's Senior Advisor, Theresa Cardinal discusses how civil rights and disaster response organizations are helping immigrants and their families affected by recent hurricanes Helene and Milton and similar natural disasters in the United States. Theresa is joined by Zach Wolgemuth, Director of Emergency Preparedness, Response and Recovery at Church World Services, along with his colleague Mabel Hernandez, Deputy Director of Operations for the Southeast region of the United States at CWS. Then, Theresa welcomes Cesar Espinoza, Co-founder and Executive Director of FIEL, the largest immigrant-led civil rights organization in Texas, to talk about the importance of the networks and immigrant leadership in supporting their communities after disasters. So stay tuned.
Last week, Hurricane Milton struck Florida, resulting in at least 24 fatalities and leaving millions without power. This was the second hurricane to hit the southeast U.S. in just 2 weeks. In late September, Hurricane Helene made landfall in northern Florida, causing extensive flooding in states like North Carolina and Georgia, with over 230 lives lost and property damage estimated at $47 billion. Just a couple of episodes ago, we discussed climate migration from less developed countries, and now there's increasing speculation about potential future mass climate migration within the United States. According to some media sources, parts of Florida are reaching their so-called tipping point. But today we want to focus on the impacts of these disasters on immigrant communities in the hardest hit areas. Immigrants and Latinos disproportionately constitute the most vulnerable low-income groups in regions affected by Helene, Milton, and potentially other hurricanes, as the Atlantic hurricane season is expected to continue until the end of November. In addition to geographical and economic challenges, these communities often face legal barriers that hinder their access to aid, putting them at risk of losing everything irreversibly. Despite recent confusion in the media, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, provides undocumented immigrants with only short-term, non-cash emergency aid, such as legal counseling. Therefore, the primary responsibility for supporting those affected falls to the nonprofit sector. So it is my pleasure now to welcome two representatives from Church World Service, which has been heavily involved in addressing the issues facing immigrants during this hurricane season. Founded in 1946, CWS is a nonprofit organization that provides humanitarian assistance and disaster relief globally. The organization focuses on refugee resettlement, community development, and emergency response, working with local partners to support vulnerable communities, promote social justice, and advocate for the rights of those affected by poverty and disaster. They also address food security, health, and education with a mission to support marginalized populations. So our first guest is Zach Wolgemuth, who's Director of Emergency Preparedness, Response, and Recovery at CWS. Zach has nearly 2 decades of service in the field, with his current role focused on addressing the nuanced challenges faced by refugees, unaccompanied children, and immigrants in the face of a disaster. And before joining CWS, he served as Associate Director at Brethren Disaster Ministries. He served at the National Voluntary Organizations Active in Disaster, which is the organization of all of the nonprofit organizations that work in disaster relief in the United States, and with the United Church of Christ. So welcome to the podcast, Zach.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
We're also pleased to welcome Zach's colleague, Mabel Hernandez, who is Deputy Director of Operations for the Southeast region for CWS. She's responsible for the day-to-day oversight of CWS's Southeast region operations based in Miami and administration for regional compliance with all of their operational standards, policies, and procedures. She's been with CWS since 2007. And as I said, she's joining us straight from Miami, where she is leading the response efforts for CWS there. So welcome to the podcast, Mabel.
Thank you. Thank you.
Before diving into how nonprofit organizations like CWS assist those affected by hurricanes, could you first help our audience understand how federal agencies address these issues? What is the role of FEMA, the Disaster Relief Fund, and local and state governments? And then how do organizations like yours work with them? Zach, do you want to take that?
Yeah, no, thank you so much. It's a great question. And without getting into a lot of detail, I think it's important to understand that disasters begin and end locally, right? And so depending on the size, scale, and scope of a disaster, obviously the state will get involved at a certain level. But when the disaster itself and the impacts of a disaster really overwhelm even state resources, that's really when FEMA steps in. So FEMA needs to be requested to come into a state, right? They don't just deploy to states. They're requested by the governor. It goes through a process, and there is a process for determining, whether or not FEMA assistance is necessary and what that really looks like. So the Disaster Relief Fund really is the fund, the kind of catch-all fund that FEMA uses to respond to disasters, to provide public assistance, which can be infrastructure support, to help rebuild roads and bridges and things like that. It also supports individuals, U.S. citizens and non-citizens that qualify for FEMA assistance in their individual recovery, which could be anything from supporting individuals who may need to bury a loved one to replacing, household items that have been damaged or destroyed, and also to even do repairs and things to homes and structures that are owned by individuals. So the fund itself is obviously approved by Congress. The amount every year is approved by Congress, and FEMA uses that to tap into a lot of these kind of different spigots of support that they turn on in kind of different types of disasters, and depending on, again, the scale, scope, and size of the disaster itself.
Yeah. So how do these government, state and local and federal government agencies work with non-governmental organizations such as yours? In what areas do you work together with government, and where do you operate independently?
Yeah, so the nonprofit organizations typically work quite well and in tandem with state, local, and federal authorities after disasters. National VOAD, National Voluntary Organizations Active in Disaster, has an MOU with FEMA. We're always coordinating at the state level, and every single state and U.S. territory has its own state or territory VOAD. So there is a structure in place, not only for organizations that work, nonprofits that work at the state level to connect with the state emergency management and with local emergency management, but also at the national level as well for those organizations that are a little bit larger to coordinate through the state VOAD, through state emergency management, and also in tandem with FEMA. There's an understanding within the sector of what types of supports FEMA provides. And really, the nonprofit sector steps in and provides additional supports to fill gaps where FEMA, is not mandated to or not able to do certain, provide certain interventions and support to citizens and communities.
So Mabel, let me bring you in here because you work in the Southeast region. So you work at that state and local level. Can you talk a little bit about, working in the state of Florida, the governor's offices or the local cities, other organizations? And in particular, there's a lot of local little community organizations that also are involved in this. How does an organization like yours coordinate both up and down that sort of organizational chart?
I've been representing Church World Service with our local VOAD in the county. So it's a voluntary organizations, active in disasters. In those meetings, we have community partners. It could be the American Red Cross, the Department of Children and Families that, provide the assistance, the recovery organizations. So we're present when these hurricanes or these disasters are brewing, so that we can start preparing and getting our clients prepared or even our local offices prepared. So we are part of, voluntary organizations, community organizations. Also, I represent CWS at the United Way Emergency Food and Shelter Board, and we have several organizations there that are active in responding to disasters. So we have those linkages or those relationships with these organizations that help us prior to a hurricane and after a hurricane, that we're able to step in, obtain information or services or resources. And not just for hurricanes. A few months ago, we had severe flooding in Fort Lauderdale in our Broward County area. So, we were present in that with other local organizations.
Yeah. So we talked about the Disaster Relief Fund, and obviously there's been a lot in the news about, what services, particularly immigrants or undocumented immigrants, are eligible for. There's another fund that FEMA manages called the Shelter and Services Fund, or the Shelter and Services Program, that has been used by localities who are assisting migrants that have arrived to their cities from the border with emergency. That is completely separate from disaster relief funding, correct?
Yes, that is absolutely correct. 100% separate. Unfortunately, there's a lot of mis and disinformation out there. And this is nothing new, but I think with, social media and bots and those types of things, unfortunately, it's only gotten a little bit worse, in recent years. And so yes. So I think, the information, the actual truth and information is out there. If folks are willing to do a little bit of digging and kind of ask the appropriate individuals who know what's happening on the ground.
Yeah, so they're separate funds funded separately by Congress. So FEMA just can't move money from one to the other. I want to make that clear to our listeners.
Correct.
Okay, so let's talk then about for specifically disaster assistance, disaster relief or recovery assistance available to non-citizens. Can you talk about what eligibility different non-citizens might have access to? In particular, whether somebody has a legal presence like a green card or maybe is here on a student visa. Obviously, we have lots of people temporarily in places, and those who might be undocumented.
Yeah, so let's start with non-citizens that would maybe qualify, that will qualify for FEMA assistance, right? And we've been trying to make sure that clear information is out there that those individuals should absolutely apply for FEMA individual assistance if they've been impacted by a disaster and their county has been declared, because they will be eligible for things like temporary housing, for cash assistance, for again support to maybe replace household items or to repair their home, those types of things. But those non-citizens that would qualify would be like your legal permanent residents, green card holders, non-citizens who have been granted asylum, refugees, non-citizens whose deportation status is being withheld or for at least 1 year, Cuban Haitian entrants, and the list actually goes on. There's several others as well, and that information can be found quite readily and easily on FEMA's website. The types of things that folks without legal status would qualify for, they may be eligible for things like crisis counseling assistance, disaster legal services, disaster case management, disaster supplemental nutrition assistance, so the DSNAP program, and other non-monetary like in-kind disaster relief programs. So there is a distinction, and folks need to kind of know where they fall as far as their status within the country to know exactly what pieces of relief and support they may be eligible for. And that's one of the big things that CWS does, right, is that information sharing, because information is power, especially in these instances. We want to make sure that folks are qualifying for and receiving, what they are rightfully, what's rightfully theirs as far as accessibility and what they qualify for, so that money's not being left on the table, right? And it's really important, especially before tapping into resources from nonprofit organizations that are typically relying on donated dollars.
Yeah. So, Mabel, the area you serve, the southeastern United States, there's lots of people and lots of different statuses, probably in the same household. How do you kind of coordinate when people come to you figuring out, well, okay, you may not have status, but your spouse does, or you have U.S. citizen kids? Does that kind of complicate the picture on the ground?
It doesn't complicate the picture. It's just getting a snapshot of the composition of that household. So you may have two undocumented parents, but they have 3 U.S. born children who are eligible for the Medicaid, for the food stamps, and for the assistance that they so readily need. It's just getting a snapshot of the family composition. We help them navigate the systems and where they can obtain this information so that they can apply for the benefits. If they need assistance in applying for the benefits, we do that for them.
Yeah. So let's dive in a little bit. What specific aid and relief services does CWS provide to immigrants and their families in the areas you serve?
Okay, so primarily the individuals that we serve in our local offices, we do have some undocumented families with minor children, and we provide them with assistance that's available to them. During the storm, if they needed to evacuation services and transportation services and emergency medical, and as Zach mentioned, crisis counseling, if they need to evacuate families, they are eligible for those services. We do also work with individuals who are newly arrived to the U.S. that do have some type of immigration status. And it's assisting them with, the DSNAP, if they've lost food, if we need to put them in emergency housing. Like we have a family that their apartment flooded. So it's finding them that temporary housing, food, trying to replace some of the items or the household items that they have. So those are the services that we provide. If we have to maybe move kids from another school, there's damages in the areas and they need to move to another location, to another city, it's assisting them with those kinds of services as well.
Yeah. Can you give us an idea of the scope of people you're helping right now? We mentioned the several states that you're working with, and obviously Helene was a huge disaster across several states, and then Milton came right on the back end for Florida. Can you just give us a sense of the scope of how many different individuals or families, households, whatever unit you use, you're assisting right now?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a little hard for us to track the actual exact number of households that are directly impacted. As Mabel pointed out, a lot of our work, is in the preparedness phase of getting information out to a lot of through our networks, not only through our church networks and our membership, but also directly to community-based organizations that have connections to a lot of these kind of communities within communities, pre-disaster. But to date, we've shipped almost $700,000 worth of material aid throughout the region from Helene and Milton. So that includes, blankets, emergency cleanup buckets, hygiene kits, period packs, those types of things that are then getting distributed by our partner network throughout the entire impacted region. So in the early phases, a lot of it really is information sharing, material aid, like I mentioned, and then also being a connector, right? So the CWS is a relatively well-known player in this space, and we have a lot of connections with a lot of organizations at the national, state, and local levels. Which comes in real handy after disaster when we are contacted and we're participating within the state VOAD coordination calls and a specific need is mentioned, or there's a community that is not receiving the support that they need. We're oftentimes able to connect those community leaders and local community-based organizations with other organizations that may have that trust within those communities, whether it be undocumented individuals or newcomer populations that may not know where to go, how to access resources, or may not trust certain groups. We're able to say, yes, you can definitely trust this organization. They're on the ground. They're going to support you. They're not going to turn you over to ICE or whatever, those types of things. So we're able to help in a lot of different ways like that as a trusted resource in preparing people and also connecting organizations and groups.
I mean, you just said $700,000 so far in aid, so it's very expensive, obviously. Where does CWS's emergency response budget come from? And how do you sort of prioritize aid recipients when estimates exceed the available resources?
Yeah, it's a great question. So a lot of our support comes from our covenant members, which are traditional Protestant church groups throughout the country that support us with actually putting together a lot of these kits, right, that get shipped to our warehouse and then from our warehouse are distributed to places in need throughout the year. So for a lot of our material aid, that's where a lot of that support comes from. And then, of course, our donor base, and we do oftentimes, seek specific grants that kind of, meet our mission and fall in line with the work that we're doing. I want to point out that these disasters, they're not sprints, they're marathons. And in many cases, many of these communities, it is going to be an ultra marathon. Unfortunately, at some point, the cameras are going to leave. And the news is going to turn, the cycle is going to turn over to something different. But these communities are going to be recovering for years to come. And so actually most of our work really falls on the latter end of the disaster response and recovery continuum, helping communities fill gaps in the recovery space, because FEMA is not an insurance company, right? They're not going to put people back to whole again. That's not their role. And so I think it's important not only for us to continue to really focus and hone in on our preparedness work that we've been doing in many communities to help communities be resilient, to build individual resilience as well, because the first responders in any community are going to be your neighbors and your friends that live close by. So we want to make sure that folks are prepared And then we also want to support the long-term recovery efforts that take years and years.
Yeah, Mabel, I mean, we've obviously talked about the hurricanes that have just hit in the last month and a half, but like Florida gets hit every year with something. Um, can you talk about some of those long-term recovery efforts that are were still ongoing at the time these new things hit?
Well, we know that there are families that are recovering from the storms. I believe it was Hurricane Ian that hit the Fort Myers, Naples area. And we have a significant migrant community in that area. And we were in contact, CWS, with local churches that had donations for those families as far as clothing and food. There are some places where where they can receive, emergency medical assistance, but a lot of them they're still struggling to put their homes back together. They're still trying to fix the roof on their homes, furnish their homes, and then the next year comes around and you're preparing for another storm. I believe it was Hurricane Irma that struck Immokalee. And, we prepared donations. We received a large number of donations from community partners, from individuals that wanted to provide donations to CWS, from diapers, from, feminine products, baby formula, trash bags, cases of water. And, we rented a U-Haul truck and we went down to Immokalee, a lot of our staff. And we provided some of the organizations that were already feeling the strain of helping their communities with resources. We were able to step in and provide those services for them and bring additional donations for them. Because some of the organizations that are working on a local level, start to feel strained because a lot of the individuals in their community need the help. And then their resources start to deplete. And then that's when, CWS steps in and tries to fill in, those gaps as best we can.
Yeah. So we talked a little bit earlier about who's eligible for federal aid, but from CWS's standpoint, do you ask about immigration or citizenship status, or do you just help everybody who's in need with whatever they can get?
We help everybody unless we need that information for specific reasons, right? Like, back to kind of what I had mentioned when we first started this conversation, that obviously we want to make sure to point people in the direction of resources and support that they qualify for before tapping into kind of, donated dollars, right, and donated support. So, so before we would, provide temporary housing, for instance, to a family that's been displaced by a disaster, we're going to make sure first that they don't qualify for FEMA temporary housing assistance. And if they do, we're gonna try to get them that FEMA temporary housing assistance that they qualify for before we would tap into our resources. But otherwise, no, right? We're here to support the entirety of the community. And so disasters don't discriminate in the sense that they impact everyone to a certain degree. Where there are discrepancies is in maybe the attention and support that a particular community gets, based on news media and also, this conversation as well, right? Certain folks with certain legal statuses, unfortunately, have access to different resources. So we're here to fill those gaps. We're here to try to level the playing field as much as possible.
Yeah. Mabel, can you talk a little bit to some of the challenges that particularly immigrant communities of whatever status may have in disasters? When you said, Zach mentioned sort of people experience it differently and may have different barriers to whether it's developing resilience or reaching out for help. From your experience, sort of what are some of those things that the immigrant communities run into?
Well, some of the challenges in preparing for these storms is that some of our families have no idea what a hurricane is, or what it means to to be in the midst of the preparation of a hurricane and after a hurricane. So we do a lot of prepping with our clients. What are the things that they need to prepare for? What are the items that they need to have? Most importantly is securing their legal documents, birth certificates, the lease of the apartment that they're renting, Social Security cards, passports. Those documents need to be secure. If you have small children, you need to be able to stock up on things for a child or an elderly person that requires special needs or medication. So it's assisting them in starting that process of understanding that this is going to be something that is going to happen every year. We need to prepare every year. So, we do that with our families, and I don't want to say it's challenging, but it's helping them understand that they do need to be prepared because these hurricanes can be serious. Then once that happens, it's, moving these families. So they've already been uprooted. They've kind of set themselves into a place, and now, their apartment has flooded. They've lost everything or what little they have, and you need to uproot them and find them, temporary housing with their families. So those are the day-to-day things that our staff encounter, in assisting our families. Fortunately, a lot of our families are doing well. Some, had to be moved into emergency shelter or emergency housing. But pretty much that's the work that our staff is doing during the storms. It's the prepping and then being in contact with our families, during the storms, after the storms, and what are the needs. And then linking them to the resources in the communities, the ones that they're eligible for, the ones that are free services, and just tapping into all of those services that are readily available for them after a storm.
Yeah. I know that in Florida, especially, there are a lot of different immigrant communities. Do you run into language or cultural issues when trying to address these situations with
We're very
immigrants?
fortunate that we have a very diverse staff, that many speak different languages. So they're able to communicate with our different clients from different cultures, different communities that speak different languages. We also use interpreter services if we need to. But, we're very fortunate to have, staff throughout the entire region that are able to communicate with most of our clients.
Yeah. So obviously this is, we talked about how it impacts immigrant communities, but your own staff are in these areas and probably are affected as well. How do you sort of balance, okay, we need to do our own emergency preparedness and response for our own families as we are reaching out to other people?
Absolutely. So, we're very lucky in our region to have Zach. And I think that last week, as we prepared for Milton, that, we were just, glued to the news and just checking on where Milton was headed, the strength of the storm. We wanted to keep our staff safe, but staff also had a duty, to provide the services to clients and get our clients safe as well. So it was, I don't want to say challenging, but it did require a lot of work and a lot of collaboration, with our headquarters team and at the local level. And then once, our staff made sure that the clients that were in evacuation zones, were evacuated, that they, got the free transportation, that were taken to shelters, then our staff had to evacuate as well. And then once the storm passed, then, it's reaching out to the different teams because we have offices in Tampa, in Orlando, and in Jacksonville. And the tornadoes hit, like the Palm Beach, Port St. Lucie area. So it's just checking in with staff. Was everyone okay? Was everyone safe? Then it's the issue of, do they have electricity? Do they have internet? Are we able to communicate with each other? And thank goodness for technology. We have security cameras in our office. So, you're able to go in there and you see that you have electricity, that you have power, that your office is still standing, that, you're going to be available to be able to provide services again to your clients. That, we were very fortunate. We were very lucky with that. But it does require a lot of planning, a lot of organizing, a lot of communication with staff, with Zach. And it's just, if there's anything that we miss on our end, Zach will say, have we thought of this? Have we thought of that? So, just a lot of coordination to be able to just manage the storm and the aftermath of the storm.
Yeah. So lastly, if our listeners want to reach out to help those who've been affected by Helene or Milton or any other disasters, how can they do so, Zach?
Yeah, so obviously we can always use the support at Church World Service. So if folks are interested in our organization and what we do in humanitarian development, disaster, and refugee resettlement work, you can go on to cwsglobal.org. And there's a lot of good information on there. there, or even if folks want to put together these kits and this material resource that goes directly to survivors after disasters, all the information's on there. But in general, I would encourage folks to check out nvoad.org. That's the National VOAD website, and of course there's a lot of trusted organizations that are members of National VOAD that provide relief and support to survivors before, during, and after disasters. And the tagline for National VOAD is the 4 C's: communication, coordination, cooperation, and collaboration. And that's really what we do as a sector, passing the baton from one organization to the next, as each of us fill a specific role in that disaster response and recovery continuum, again, working in tandem with the public and private sectors as well. So, so check out cwsglobal.org, and, thank you so much for your time today.
Well, thank you so much, Zach and Mabel, for all the work that you have done and are doing. So we're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we'll talk with Cesar Espinoza, whose organization has been helping immigrants in the Houston area for years, to discuss the importance of community support and immigrant help in those communities. Stay tuned. I am delighted to welcome our next guest, Cesar Espinoza, who is co-founder and Executive Director of FIEL, Familias Inmigrantes y Estudiantes en la Lucha, which is the largest immigrant-led civil rights organization in Texas. Cesar is himself an immigrant from Mexico and a proud Houstonian. He arrived in the U.S. in 1991 at the age of 5 and is currently a DACA recipient. His nonprofit, FIEL, aims to empower the immigrant community in Houston, throughout Texas, and across the United States. He has served on various boards at the local, state, and national levels and is committed to addressing issues such as race relations, police reform, and uplifting diverse communities. Hello, Cesar, and welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
So in this podcast, we're talking about how organizations help immigrants who have been victims of natural disasters, such as hurricanes and floods and fires and all kinds of other stuff. And in the first part of the podcast, we spoke with representatives from Church World Services, which is like an international relief organization, about the impact of hurricanes on immigrant communities in general, particularly in the Southeast, as well as the roles of government and nonprofits in providing that aid and relief. Can you tell us more about how a local organization such as yours serves communities impacted by natural disasters there in Houston?
Well, first of all, if you had asked me 17 years ago if we were going to be doing disaster recovery, I would have said, "What are you talking about?" Because that's not what we had intended to do. But, FIEL had very humble beginnings. And as time went on and we in the community began to ask for more help in a variety of ways, then unfortunately, we found ourselves in a situation where we had to respond to natural disasters. And I think the biggest one, or the one that was really eye-opening, was Harvey. For the Houston area, Harvey had a grave impact. We had to step in, and we had to step in because we during the hurricane, prior to the hurricane, people started calling in our office as to where can I go and get help. Then during the hurricane, people were calling us, literally asking us if they should evacuate or what should they do. And then afterwards, obviously with all the devastation, people were asking us how they could recover. And I'm glad this is a 10-hour podcast because we have so many stories coming out of Harvey that are impactful. But I think the one that's going to stick with me for the rest of our lives is, as we were going with our team with no help other than volunteers, we were going into some of these hardest hit apartment complexes. I clearly remember a lady standing outside of her door, clenching her hands and saying, "FIEL is here. I knew you guys were not going to leave us alone." And so I think that reiterated the fact that so many people trust in us that it only made sense for us to do disaster recovery. So ever since we have done disaster recovery non-formally. Informally have done disaster recovery, but we have learned a lot in how to help immigrant communities after natural disasters.
Yeah. So do you work with the local or state government or other relief organizations in this work, or is it kind of we're on our own and we do what we can with the folks we have?
Well, I mean, the first time we did it, and I go back to the example of Harvey, it was just kind of like, what do we do? We started asking ourselves, what do we do? And so, thankfully, people, we were at a point in FIEL's history where people kind of knew we were working with immigrants. So we received support from a myriad of organizations, and it was at this one point it was overwhelming the amount of support that we received. I mean, we were getting calls 24 hours a day from people from Colorado, from New York, from Chicago, sending trucks of aid here, and they knew that we were going to get it into the hands of working immigrant class people. And so it was a good problem to have at that point.
Yeah. So talk about exactly what kind of help you help with your community. You just had another hurricane come through earlier this year, Beryl, in July. What are the kind of specific things that you help immigrants in your community with in the wake, ahead of, or in the wake of such a hurricane?
Well, now we help in three. I want to say in three ways. Number one is we help with hurricane preparedness at our office. There's always information on how to get ready for hurricanes. One of the interesting things that we found out is that because people are new to the area, they've never experienced such a thing as hurricanes. They may have experienced other things like earthquakes or landslides or other things like that, but hurricanes are not necessarily something that people have gone through before, so they don't know what to expect. The second thing we help is we help people after the storm. We help people generate funds. We do crowdfunding to make sure that people get the immediate help that they need, and then they get follow up help after the immediate help is has run out. Traditionally, the Red Cross and other organizations help, but for the immigrant community, you have to find a specific way to help. And let me explain that. For a lot of our folks, they don't have bank accounts. So when an organization like the Red Cross or other people want to help, and they tell people we'll direct deposit this money into your account, and people don't have a way to access that money, then at the end of the day they can't get that help. And so we help by helping those organizations figure out other ways and that they can deliver the aid without there being so much red tape. And the third thing we do is we help in actual evacuation plans, or we create bridges with local, state, and federal officials on how they can convince people or how they can help people follow government directives and let them know that it is okay to receive the help. For example, in some other natural disasters, people have been afraid to ask for help or been afraid to evacuate or seek shelter because they're afraid that immigration is going to be there or that they're going to be questioned about their status when they get there. So we help to ameliorate those concerns by telling people the truth and partnering up with local, state, and federal agencies to make sure that people get the correct information and the truth about what's really happening.
Yeah, it's historically, immigration enforcement has said we will not enforce during natural disasters. We will not be at FEMA shelters. That's been traditionally the case. And I know during the most recent hurricanes, Milton and Helene, FEMA would send out announcements saying we're not going to be doing immigration enforcement. But you're saying that your community, not quite sure if we trust it or not. And so you're the trusted voice that helps them say, It's okay. You need to protect yourself and your family." Is that correct?
Well, the thing is here is that these are federal or declared federal disaster areas. So even though the government says that, but then they put national security trucks outside of the George R. Brown or outside of things, it sends mixed messages. So
Right.
those are the kind of nuances that we try to talk to these different agencies of saying, yes, we welcome the help, but try to avoid the visuals, right? Or try to make sure. Just a few years ago, about 4 years ago, there was a rodeo. Houston is known for the Houston Livestock Show and Rodeo, and there was a huge concern on one of the opening days because there was Department of Homeland Security trucks out here because it is considered a massive event
A
where their
security event. They need to
participation
secure it.
is
Yeah.
required. And a lot of people were saying they were not going to go to the rodeo because immigration was there. So those are the things that we try to bring to the attention to make sure that we avoid those misunderstandings and that at the end of the day, people can get the help that they gravely need at the time.
Yeah. So you yourself are an immigrant. How were you and your organization affected by Burl and some of the other hurricanes that have hit Houston since you lived there?
Well, as everybody, we've suffered. We've been lucky that the two major storms that we've had, or that we've lived through, or the many major storms, actually, I should say that we've lived through. Our family has been okay. The only difference with Barrow is that our families were okay, our homes were okay. We just didn't have power for a few days, but we learned to manage. We buy generators and things like that, and but unfortunately, in this last turn, when we were going back to the office to start the plan to help people rebuild, we found ourselves now needing the help. So our office, our headquarters here in Houston, were destroyed by Hurricane Beryl. The hurricane, there was no flooding in our office, but the hurricane did take part of the roof. And it happened to take the part of the roof that was over our office, and so we had to, in essence, evacuate our office, and within 3 days, and find a new office space. And it was really challenging, but at the end of the day, it was a stark reminder of that these things do have consequences. They really can help and hurt a lot of people. They really can hurt a lot of people in a variety of ways, including a lot of small business owners.
Yeah. So, how do you provide help to others when you are also affected?
We're resilient. We break up our team. We delegate, and I say, I, as the executive director, I'm gonna bury myself in paperwork. Going to go look at spaces today, and everybody else is that we're gonna set up another team to clean up and pick up our old office, and then we're gonna designate another team to not help with this part out, but help answer the phones and answer people's questions, and do what we can. So we spread ourselves pretty thin, but I think we're able to do all three of the things simultaneously, and be able to help out not only ourselves, but then also be able to answer the community's questions during these times.
So, there's a common belief that tragedies unite people. Have you seen more cooperation and solidarity among the immigrants you work with, their families, or the broader immigrant community in Houston or even Texas after these disasters hit?
I think it's remain about the same. I mean, people, we help them, as many people as we can, and we also have to be realistic and know that we're only a small part of Houston's. We can only get to a small part of Houston's population, but at the end of the day, I think the more people learn from it, the what we have seen throughout the years is the more people learn from it, the more the Comadre network, or the network of people who share information, grows, and then more people are more likely to evacuate or to heed the warnings ahead of time than not. I mean, I think Hurricane Allison and other hurricanes that have happened before, even my family was very reluctant to leave because we were like, nothing's going to happen. But living through a hurricane is a big ordeal, and it is very scary. And so I think the more people witness or are a part of these disasters, the more they're willing to get away from them and heed those warnings after they happen, or before
Yeah.
they happen, rather.
Yeah. So, how do you typically mobilize and engage volunteers? Do you have people that reach out to you to try to help others, or are you actively, do people you help turn out to then turn around and help other people?
We have a core team of volunteers that are willing, that are literally willing to pick up at any time and come help. And we rely on those folks to be able to respond to a lot of these things that happen spontaneously. And the interesting part about that is that they will recruit other folks, and sometimes other folks come in from out of town, and they can also help. The challenge is when are they able to help? Because you gotta, like during Harvey, the person that works, hand in hand with me, he rode his bike to the George R. Brown because he couldn't get his car out of his driveway, and I'm like, that's very intense. And he was like, you got to come now because there's a ton of people not knowing what to do, and I couldn't leave the area where I was at. So a lot of it is, even though we rely on these people, we also have to keep in mind that sometimes they are also going through the notions of maybe having losing a home, or losing a car, or are just unable to get to the disasters. But we're always ready and willing to help. I remember during this last hurricane, I remember telling my wife the night before it hit, I told her, I was like, I just want to remind you that as soon as I'm able to get out of the house, I'm gonna be out there with our team, helping people. Little did we know that our office was being destroyed as I was uttering those words.
Yeah. So you talked about this a little bit. Obviously, a lot of your constituents are undocumented in the United States, and there's a lot of back and forth right now about federal assistance and disasters and who it's going to. But most of those people are not going to be able to get federal aid. So other than like not being eligible for that, what other barriers do they face in getting help? And can you just sort of delineate sort of where they like, or is there state aid or local aid, or is it all nonprofits that they have to rely on, or other people in their community?
Well, one of the things that we do is we do tell people that if they are part of mixed status families, they may be able to qualify for aid. So if somebody in the house is a U.S. citizen, they could qualify for some sort of aid, one way or another. The other thing is a lot of the times the county or local government puts forward aid, and we make sure that people get connected to that, and not in the ways that in the traditional ways where, okay, we're just going to send you a text or a link, because sometimes people don't even have access to phones or internet, but rather we go door to door and offer people this type of help. And then the third thing is we crowdfund and we connect people to resources where they can get money on the spot sometimes. And when I mean money on the spot, I mean after some of these natural disasters, we either go get money and go buy money orders, or we offer people cash assistance on hand, because some folks don't even have the mobility to be able to go to the store and get that money or things of that nature.
Yeah. So as a community organizer, you've got 2 decades of experience. Where do you see the largest need for help today? And what can individuals who wish to assist, perhaps those listening now, do right now to help organizations like yours?
I think the most important thing that where people need the most help is in information or lack of information. A lot of the times people have misconceptions, or they've heard through somebody that they may be able to qualify for something, may be able to get some type of assistance. And this happens a lot too on the immigration front. Sometimes people believe that because a family member fixed their papers in a certain way that they can't do it too. But it's really important to look at those details, those fine details, those dates, and things like that. So information, being able to access the community and in unconventional or traditional ways, more saying it like that, is really important. For example, during COVID, we did a survey here in the Houston area in a suburb called Pasadena, where we found out that 72% of people don't have access to a laptop or in-home internet. So when the government was asking them, oh, you got to sign up on this website or on this portal to get your vaccine, and people were not able to access them through cell phone devices, then they were not going to be able to get the help. So after the survey, we turned that information over to the county. The county made everything mobile friendly, and you saw the numbers in that area skyrocket because people were now getting the help. And in terms of what help do we need all the help we can get. Small organizations like ours rely on community support, rely on donations to keep going. And we are able to do a lot of the work that some other larger nonprofits are not able to do, because we are in touch with the community 24/7. We do hear the problems that people have, and it's important to get that point across.
So thank you, Cesar, for all of this. Do you have any final thoughts for our audience to help them understand the needs of immigrants in natural disasters?
I mean, I think it's important to, in any natural disaster, whether it's a flood or an ice storm or whatever it may be, I think it's important to step outside of the box and really talk to immigrants and ask them what they would like to see different, and maybe do this prior to disaster. So then that way we can get a plan going, or figure out what people's needs are before the time actually comes. And so I think it's important for any city in the United States that has immigrant populations to do this work ahead of time. So when the disasters do happen, which unfortunately we're going to face a lot more of with climate change and all that stuff, that they are ready to respond to their communities and not scrambling at the last minute to see how they're going to help.
Well, thank you, Cesar, for joining us today. And I think we'll wrap that up here. But best of luck to you and to your colleagues. And hopefully it's a while before you have to encounter another hurricane in Houston.
I sure do hope so. But at the end of the day, we'll still be here to help.
Take care.
Thank you.
And that's a wrap on this episode of This Week in Immigration. One last reminder to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform, and share it with your friends and colleagues. You can also find our podcast episodes on the Bipartisan Policy Center YouTube channel. You can find more information on all the issues we discuss here on the show at bipartisanpolicy.org/immigration. You can follow the Bipartisan Policy Center on the X platform at BPC_bipartisan. You can follow Theresa Cardinal Brown at BPC_T Brown. And you can follow me at Jack Malday. Send your comments and feedback to us by email to immigration@bipartisanpolicy.org. I'm Jack Malday. This Week in Immigration was created and executive produced by Theresa Cardinal Brown. This episode was written by myself, Rennie Mockery, and Theresa Cardinal Brown. Joshua Joe is our audio editor. The executive producer of BBC Podcasts is Lucy Manning. Talk to you next time on This Week in Immigration.